Good morning.
Good morning.
Is this better? Everybody here?
Sounds good.
Yep.
As we did the other day, is there anyone new here today for the first time?
George, are you new?
And you've been here before, Frank, and you get my emails, don't you?
Yes.
Would you please? Well, first of all, I prefer not to say you. What's your name? Bob?
Yeah.
I can remember that. I'm Bob, too. Put your email address on that list somewhere.
I don't have pockets on this shirt, so I can't carry it. Bad shirt. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Everybody else here has been here before. No other new people? We got one more new person in the back. Sal, when Bob finishes putting his address down. I'm sorry, what is your name, young lady?
Jean Howell.
Jean?
Nice young
Right.
lady.
I love the young ladies that come to this meeting. Right, Martha? We have so much to talk about. It's an easy thing to find targets. It's hard to choose which one to begin with. I thought I'd start by perhaps discussing Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's been
Oh,
in the news a little bit recently.
Right.
Does anybody here not know who Marjorie Taylor Greene is? Charles, do you want to start off and tell us a little bit about her?
I don't know.
Oh,
That's why I raised my hand.
I actually go to a place, Jacques doesn't know her, I used to go to a place called Many Streams Ranch outside of Rome, Georgia. And I went there for the purpose of joining one of my little religious groups to convene with God and nature. They elected by an unopposed candidate for Congress this last time. And I'm going to, first of all, let me say this group that I go visit with in Rome has given me such an attitude toward Rome, Georgia, that I just think there's this cloud of love and peace hanging over the city. They elected Marjorie Taylor Greene to Congress. And I called my friends and I said, did I misread the district from which she was elected? Who'd like to start with a brief? Well, I'll just say, Marjorie Taylor Greene first came to some level of infamy a couple of years ago when she declared the shootings in Parkland and Connecticut to be false flags, to be staged, and they hired actors to play the role of the students who spoke out, particularly that young man Goff. She, on her website, which I went to this morning, she has three basic promises. She is anti-abortion, she's pro-gun, and she's pro-choice. And those are the three things that, I'm sorry, not pro-Trump. Freudian slip of some sort. Her fame recently is that she admits to leading a fairly large delegation on a tour of the Capitol the day before January 6th. And that's leading, of course, to some pretty interesting investigations because, as you all probably remember, there were members of that group, the riot group, who seemed to know their way around. And the question has been asked, how did they know whose office was whose and how to find those offices in the maze of offices in the Capitol building and in the adjacent office buildings? And the question was, had they recently been led around by either members of the House or staff? Her next claim to fame was to insist upon her right to carry a gun into the floor of the House. She is unapologetic. She's been assigned to the Education Committee of the House. And this after denying or poo-pooing the school killings. So she's a bit controversial, to say the least. Part of me says it's a free country. Everybody has a vote, including the residents of Rome, Georgia. And if they choose to elect that person to Congress, we seat her, and we respect her views and her votes. That's what we stand for. And just as we might, some would say, foolishly elect a Democratic Socialist, for example, from Vermont. Vermont has a right to do that, as does Brooklyn. I'm talking about Bernie and AOC. Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene just happens to be somebody some of us may not like. So that's part of me that says that. Another part of me says, gosh, I wonder if it's appropriate to seat in the House somebody who comes in with stories of making up a shooting. Is that appropriate? Should we draw a line somewhere and say this person shouldn't be seated and the people in her district should be denied their right to seat her? Comments? Phoebe?
She was elected and she.
Sir, but I would not give her any position on a committee.
Certainly not.
Do you have to be on a committee?
Yes.
Well, I don't know that you have to be, but I think everybody is. And I wonder what on earth Congress people do if they're not on a committee.
That would, she would serve, but she wouldn't be on a committee. You
It's
shouldn't
like
give her any power.
giving her an office and no phone. Any other comments?
She also, just a minute,
Do we not have two mics today?
we do, and
She-
she's taking that side, so just be patient.
She also spoke about putting a bullet through Nancy Pelosi's head.
Yeah.
That was one of her other statements.
No, she's not violent. She's her speech is violent or offensive, but she has not yet shot Nancy
No.
Pelosi.
God, what a horrible thought.
So I'm personally very torn. I find the whole idea of a Marjorie Taylor Greene offensive, but I also, this lingering part of me. Ed, do you want to say something about this?
I think it's up to the other people in Congress to deal with her. She should be seated, but the other members of Congress should take into account her views and not listen to her.
I think at the end of the day, first of all, I think at the end of the day, we're not going to decide that here, much to my chagrin. And that's number one. Number two, I think I think the rule will obtain that people have the choice to do stupid things. That's their right. And if electing this young lady to Congress is what they choose to do, they can. The members of the House, on the other hand, have the right to manage their body. And each caucus, the Republican and the Democratic caucus, has the right to seat them on committees and give them other assignments. And if they choose to, they could say no committee assignments. It'd be unusual, but if it has been done, I think there have been other flagrant abusers who were disciplined in that way, but they were allowed to sit in Congress. So that's one topic. I'm going to suggest some, but I'm absolutely open to topics from the floor. We could talk, first of all, the things that I sent out this past week included a fairly lengthy bit on Iran, on immigration, on the possibility, I loved it, of Biden governing in poetry. Did you all receive that? Have a chance to read it? Fintan O'Toole, who wrote the second of the three articles, second and third of the three articles that were in that package. And by the way, for the new people here and for those who've had trouble with their email, I frequently copy the things that I read out into a Word format and send them out in emails. The bit on Iran ran to 69 pages. So we've decided not to do tests on whether you've read them or not. But I think some of the articles there are really quite interesting. The Marjorie Taylor Greene thing that I found was a long backgrounder in New York Magazine. And it was probably 18 pages long, printed out. I haven't sent it around yet. But I like that level of background depth. And it's all in an effort, and we've talked about this many times before, it's all in an effort to find the truth, to find out as much background as possible. The headlines, whether they're in the print press or the electronic media, the print press is, the headlines are just so misleading that to me. And discerning bias is, I think, just hugely important in all press. We can talk about the filibuster. Interested in that? It's growing now because it's highly likely that, and we could let's talk about the filibuster in conjunction with the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill that has begun to grow legs now. Thoughts? Jim, thank you. I'll fill the silence, you know that.
Yeah, just a comment on the filibuster. Didn't Biden just say basically he's not going to be supportive of eliminating the filibuster?
Biden has said that more than once,
Yeah.
and he's repeated it recently. And of course, Joe Manchin and Sistema, the senator from Arizona, have both said they'll vote against it. So it's not going to pass, at least now. I think the likelihood of something coming up in the course of, over the next few months that leads them to say that something is so important that we're not going to allow it to be filibustered to death, it's likely that'll change. I've said before here that I join with Manchin and others in being reluctant to eliminate the filibuster. The more I read and study the origins of the filibuster, how it's been used, the less enamored I am of its value. Its primary purpose for a long time was strictly to fight any civil rights legislation. I think it came into existence in part in that late 19th century series of congressmen post the effort to beat back Reconstruction, the beginning of Jim Crow, and has been used primarily before the recent change. And just by background, the origin of the filibuster was you had to stand up and talk until you were exhausted. The great Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington movie talked about that. Then it was modified to with a thing called cloture, where 60 senators could vote to stop this long-winded filibuster. But that still required somebody to stand and talk for a period of time. That was then modified to its present situation where you don't have to stand up at all. You just have to put your name in and say, I intend to filibuster, or I filibuster this as a senator. And that means that in order for there to be any debate on it, you have to have cloture, which is a strange thing. But since it requires no presence, no speaking, no real difficulty, almost everything is almost axiomatically frustrated by a notice of filibuster, which means before anybody or anything is discussed on the floor of the Senate, you have to have 60 votes without going through all the rigmarole. The rigmarole slowed down what was probably a pretty nefarious practice, but without it, it's just changed. It's now no longer a majoritarian body. It's an anti-majoritarian body. One could argue that the Senate was created to prevent mob rule, and therefore should have been anti-majoritarian. It wasn't really created that way at all by the founders. It was just as democratic in terms of its actions as the House. It was not selected in the same democratic way, but it was meant to function that way. The more I think about it, the more I think I'd come down in favor of eliminating it, even though I know what that means is the thin edge of a one-vote majority in the Senate for one side now is almost certainly going to be for the other side in either 2 years or 4 years. I think the principle of the filibuster is not, I wonder why we still have it. Does that make any sense? Don?
Doesn't this really come down to a problem of how our legislative function does not function? It's become a game of two parties playing games against each other, and so you have, as in the past Congress, stuff sitting on the speaker's desk or somebody, and never getting moved into a vote.
Yeah.
Why can't they vote on everything? That could be a game too, I suppose, but it's the way it is now. It is being stifled by an individual or a relatively small group of individuals. It can make things really non-democratic.
Yeah, and I suppose those who would argue in favor of the current system, a system developed over, as you know, a long period of time, those rules were designed to make things happen. They weren't, and to happen thoughtfully and intelligently. The idea that the Speaker of the House can literally say, we're not going to vote, doesn't sound like that at all. Or that the Speaker of the House can simply say, we're going to run this through very rapidly. Judgeships, 300 judgeships approved in the last Congress. The mechanics of the Senate are not designed for that. Things had to be done to make that happen. I'm not saying anything was done illegally, but certainly unlike the pattern of senatorial consideration. And I agree with you completely. I think it's no longer as much making decisions, it is playing games.
We have the same problem now with the Puerto Rico and the D.C. statehood. The only reason it's not happening because they have, in some cases, a greater population than some of the states. In fact, several of the states put together, is that they're not Republican or they're not Democratic parties at the moment, at least, and so we don't want them.
Yeah.
And that's not the process.
Many of you here appear to be of an age that you remember when Hawaii and Alaska were made states. That was more or less a joke. All of us were here when that happened. Or I should say otherwise, with those who weren't here, raise your hand. Was there then this debate about the partisanship of each of those two states?
There was a trade-off.
Yes.
There were.
There was a trade-off.
So Alaska came in because that had 2 Republican senators and Hawaii 2 Democrat. Hawaii 2. And so it's the same process. Interesting. Jacques?
In relation to what you were saying, am I right? If my recollection right, I remember seeing on TV a certain senator of Texas reading books of Dr. Seuss.
Telephone books, yeah.
Did you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah, you don't. I have seen. I think his name is Cruz.
yes, exactly.
I didn't want to mention him, but he was to prevent the development of the session. As a filibuster, he started to read Dr. Seuss.
Yeah.
in the Senate. Nobody remember that.
Oh, that was fairly recent, actually. That was,
No, that's not so recent. I think it was 5 years ago.
well, I'm thinking.
Yeah, but I'm young, you know.
Everything is
Anyway,
Martha and I think 5 years ago was fairly recent.
I just was saying this because that's an example of,
Oh, no,
typical
precisely.
example of what you were talking about, you know,
Precisely.
to prevent, to stall everything, you know, but just, it prevents other people to,
There was-
it prevents other people to speak.
Exactly.
This is what Don was saying, it's not democratic.
Exactly. There was a rule until quite recently, and I don't know when it was changed, that any senator had the right to block any candidate for office by simply putting, when he hears the name of a nominee, sending in his intention to oppose. And that nominee's death, the process died an early death. Do any of you remember what I'm talking about?
Green slip. Green slip, those slips that they can put in.
Oh, is that what it was, a green slip?
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. You're welcome to chime in anytime you want, because quite often I make this shit up. I make some things up. I don't. The other piece I sent out was about Iran, and I think we could possibly talk about that a few minutes. Then we're going to shift over to the new government, the cabinet positions, and who's been brought. I'm going to ask Phoebe and Carolee to stand up. Let's talk about Iran a little bit. The news there essentially has to do with Tony Blinken and his intention to do what we knew was going to happen, which is rejoin in some fashion a revised Iran nuclear accord. The implications of that are numerous, and I'm open to comments about that. I assume there's a certain amount of opposition to that in this room, or not? Charlie?
Continue.
Martha?
Well, it seems
to me that under the treaty, it was a win-win-win situation because there were international inspectors who were free, I believe, to inspect any area or building or whatever. And the economy of Iran certainly did better because there weren't all of these curbs on their trade
Exactly.
and economy. And the whole world did better because of these checks and balances. And I think Biden and Blinken are absolutely right in trying to get back to the table. Now, of course, they're going to have to be careful, you know, that they don't give away too much, that it's the sort of balance that we had before.
Exactly. I think that the two objections, and I understand why most people would object to them, but the two objections were first that there were activities that were not covered by the treaty, specifically support for the terrorist groups Hezbollah and Hamas, I guess was the other one. That was one. And the other was the duration. that the sunset came too soon in the mind of many. I don't remember hearing much in the way of criticism either of the inspection regime that was set up during this arguably short term, nor anything of any realistic argument that there were violations of the specific agreements of what Iran said they would not do, they did not do. Now, I'm open to somebody correcting me on that. Those 2 points, though, the sunset came too soon, and that the other activities weren't covered, are valid points. Should you accept half a loaf in a negotiation rather than going for everything at the expense of that half loaf not being obtained for years to come? I wasn't at the table, but I can certainly understand somebody saying, if we're here to prevent their nuclear activity or delay their nuclear activity, let's not say you can have nuclear bombs or advance your nuclear capability as long as you still want to have terrorist groups. To me, it's a lose-lose. Charles, I think you said, I could tell by your countenance that you disagree with me.
For change. Okay, you're going to hope. I don't profess to know too much about that whole situation, the pros and cons, but I have a feeling that we're just not negotiating with the right people. I don't think they're negotiators. I think they have their own agenda, and the consequences of them going ahead the way they would like to go ahead, I think are dire. And my feeling that they're not the country that is looking to really make something work together.
Are you talking about our negotiators or the
Iranians?
I'm sorry?
The Iranian.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Iranians. Yeah, I don't think they negotiate from a real desire for peace.
Let's go Don first and then Martha.
What I've read over the years, the Iranian leaders do not represent the population of the country, except to their religious relationship. And it would not be too difficult. I probably shouldn't say that, but there is a distinct feeling amongst the general population that they don't want this kind of conflict going on all the time. And many of the younger people are quite pleased with, what's the word I want? Look to the United States as being the kind of society they'd like, because they don't like this dictatorial religious presence. So how far the leadership can really go in Iran is questionable to me. I think they hold quite a bit of power in terms of this relationship, but I think that we have to be at the table and play this game with the leadership as long as we can to keep them in line.
Martha?
Well, again, and with what Don just said, the economy is not good, and the general population doesn't like that, especially the young people. And so, let's try.
Yeah, the tragedy of almost all economic boycotts, sanctions, is that they really don't hit the people that are making the decisions. It's true in our country as well as any other country. The top layer, whether it's Russia or China or Iran or anywhere else, is not very much affected by sanctions. It's the common people whose lives are miserable in a sanctioned state. I don't know that we can change that. But I do think that every effort should be made to sit at the table and hold out the prospect of eliminating or reducing sanctions, changing them. A problem I have, and I think this, by the way, in Cuba, where sanctions, I think, have been on for too long, ridiculous period of time, and have less effect now than they had at the beginning. China, where we are not sanctioning as much as I think we perhaps should, the treatment of the Uyghurs, possibly the actions in Hong Kong. But again, it's that blunt instrument of a sanction. Who does it hurt? And if it doesn't hurt the decision maker, why would he change his mind about the decisions he's making? Unless they are terribly interested in the well-being of the population, which I haven't seen much evidence of. Ed?
I just wanted to bring out a little broader point. We've got a problem with nuclear weapons. They're easier to make, more countries can make them. And if we don't stop, we may get a problem with small countries all over the world being able to start conflicts, nuclear conflicts, that will be hard to contain. Therefore, that's just an argument for continuing talks and stopping Iran from making nuclear weapons.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And one of the other problems of some of these rogue states or smaller states having nuclear capability is they have a desire to sell that for a profit. We all worried about Korea doing it. I think maybe the worst offender was Pakistan, who sold their technology, was it to Libya, I think, before Libya stepped down. So the idea of sitting at the table, of having a disarmament policy, staff, and organization, to me is a no-brainer. We should over and over again sit down. And I personally would accept a short-lived agreement rather than no agreement at all, hoping that after we enter into that shorter-lived agreement, we could sit down again and go for a longer one. I do think that the idea of allowing the terrorist organizations freedom and allowing Iran to support them to the extent it does is something we should almost treat as aggressively as we do their nuclear capacity. Because they really don't have the capacity yet. They're making it. They are actually using Hezbollah. On the other hand, the Saudis are using their own opposition to Hezbollah. Charles?
How do you do that?
How do you stop the support of those terrorist groups?
Yeah.
I think it's not, personally, I think it's not unlike nuclear research or development activity. You have to get somebody on the other side to agree. And that means we're going to have to give them something in exchange for that agreement to stop. But in addition to that, obtaining the agreement is develop a policing capability. And in the case of support for Hezbollah, I don't know whether it's a policing in terms of transfer of funds. I don't have the answers there, but
It sounds like you're doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that in terms of which direction you want to go. You want to go, on one sense, you want to contain them, but on the other hand, that you don't want to put in the rules that will contain them.
Oh, no. I think rules that contain Hezbollah, we're talking about that, should be put in place. There's no question about it. And we should, in order to obtain that, we may have to give them something, but it's not giving them the right to play with their Hezbollah. They have to stop that, stop it cold. And that's a hard thing to do. Again, it's hard because of policing. Take the example of the Wahhabi support for the madrasas around the world. That support doesn't come from the Saudi government as such. It comes from wealthy Saudis, all of whom, by the way, are princes, and you could say arguably are part of the government. But how do you police that? How do you stop their providing money through the various methods to an activity we don't like? Jacques?
Yeah, I think that some time there is nothing to do. The best thing is not to do anything. And I'll give you an example which everybody remembers. At the time of Iraq, we kicked out Saddam Hussein, who was not a nice fellow, but the result of it is very well known, that immediately you had ISIS taking over Iraq almost, and then we had to send troops and help the Iraqi people, etc., etc. And we gave a tremendous power to ISIS and all those people. And so it's really not a question of sending troops. You're not going to send troops to people who are doing little things here, little thing there. The French do it in Africa without very limited success. And so the thing is, the main thing I would say is to have a good international policy. And one thing about on the Arab world, I mean, it is not to put a match in that part of the world. I mean, this is a part of the world which since the First World War, when after the treaties of Versailles and the disparition of the Ottoman Empire, you just put a light and everything burns, you know. So when you think about, little things to do to fight this group of terrorists and this group of terrorists, I don't want to say that, in my opinion, that doing nothing is not good. No. What I mean to say is that a lot of those people are fighting their little war because of international relation which has been messed up.
An interesting analogy, just a thought occurred to me when you talk about throwing a match on a risky place. Interestingly enough, most of the places where we've thrown that match have oil, which burns brightly. Don?
We keep talking about the United States doing this, that, and the other thing. And that train of thought is a singular one. We should be getting other people involved.
Sure.
We should be. What is the United Nations sitting there in New York? What are they doing? And it's a nice building and all that, but governments, individual governments, I'm sure are very reluctant to give them more power because they feel somehow they lose control. But that's what has to happen in some fashion to get the group to say to these people, these little countries, you got to stop this. And if you don't, we're going to do all of these things as a group, not just the bad boy United States doing this.
I certainly agree with that. Don Furman?
We've lost that ability these last 4 years. We've divorced ourselves from NATO as much as we can. Look what's happening in Mexico. We're just not uniting. We can't unite ourselves, much less anyone else at this time.
It's a good point. And the fact of the matter is, it's not just the United Nations, it's every international body is in disrepute now, that the whole Iran Accord. Frank?
If you recall, in 1950, we fought the Chinese in a war. I was there. We could have just abandoned the South Koreans and taken the path of least resistance, but we stayed, we negotiated from strength, and who's to say that, who would believe that in 1945 the Soviet Union would be brought to its knees in the next 50 years, that you wouldn't have an uprising from within. Certainly the people in Iran aren't happy with their government, and they're hanging on by fingernails. So I think it's always best if you're talking, you're not fighting. But we've got to negotiate from strength, because there's no question in my mind that China wants to acquire Taiwan and put them under their umbrella. And look at what Trump did in the Middle East. How many of those Arab countries now have gotten together and aligned themselves for their mutual protection. So I think we should continue to, as I say, negotiate, but do it from strength.
I agree with that completely. And an interesting footnote, I think we might be talking about this soon, is I think I read that Biden's team just denied some planes to
Yeah.
one of the Arab Gulf countries that had signed the so-called Abraham Accords.
No, not the South. United Arab.
Yeah, but I think the United Arab Emirates are one of the things. Ted?
My question would be, how do you think we could best negotiate with North Korea?
They're so willing to sit down and talk to us, especially if there's a cameraman close. Jim? I've got an answer.
Just a comment on what Ted said. I think you can't negotiate with North Korea unless you have China involved, because they continue to support North Korea, and unless you get them to agree on a bigger picture item, the North is going to do what they want.
You know, I think that's totally true, and the whole relationship with China, I think that deserves a great deal of time and a whole separate meeting. We built some power plants in China, and so I've got a little bit of a bias for working with them as opposed to against them. And I've disclosed that bias. I've always thought the Chinese were very insistent upon their realm. They want to clearly what's in that part of the world they think should be controlled or managed by the Chinese, not by anywhere else. But I've never thought their intention was to move beyond that, to take, I don't think they're looking to land on the shores of California or Oregon or Washington. I don't think that's their threat at all. I'm not so sure that's true of the other side. If Russia could go back to a more aggressive policy, I'm inclined to think they would, but they don't. They're almost a non-player now. China is going to be a really big player. They're already very big. They're going to be so much bigger over the next 25 or 30 years, and I think we all know that. And it's not just because we're building iPhones there. They've got a massive economy in terms of size, and a little bit of improvement for everybody is just because there are so many bodies, a massive improvement generally. How do you stop that? Now, first of all, how do you stop it? I don't think you can, so why not join with China aggressively in dealing with matters like Korea? Because absent that combined ability, we're never going to change Korea, I don't think.
And Taiwan?
Taiwan is tough for me. I think that, but again, join with China and discussing the rights of some non-mainland Chinese to exist and thrive. And I just don't know. Traditionally, the issue with Taiwan is that was the enemy. That's where the nationalist Chinese went, and in their escape from the communists. So that island was the island of the enemy. That's really no longer the case. But I certainly don't have an answer. I'm positive the answer's in this room, but I don't have it.
Bob, I think you're being very kind to China.
Yeah.
They have 1,300,000,000 people, and 1 billion people don't have running water. They don't have electricity. They live like paupers. The 300 million, I guess you could compare their standard of living to ours because they're the haves. But the have-nots sooner or later might rise up and say, we want the same thing that the Chinese Communist Party leaders have.
Yeah, an interesting thing there, Frank, I certainly agree with that size population, the number of poor has to be huge. And my argument for a long time had always been we're losing the battle against global poverty. all the things that we're doing in every place we're doing them have failed. About 20 years ago, that began to be false. Why? It's because a significant portion of the Earth's population moved from abject poverty into lower middle class. Where did that occur? China. And it wasn't a couple of guys. It was 500 million people moved from abject poverty into a lower middle class existence. And the reason for it was capitalism. Now, it's a controlled totalitarian state, kind of strange capitalism, but it is capitalism. And it's been phenomenal. The second largest increase in people moving out of poverty is India, but it's second by quite a bit. And that's something I don't think enough of us appreciate. Whatever China is doing to manage their economy is working pretty well relative to what almost every other country is doing, certainly countries in Africa and some parts of the rest of Asia. And that's something I don't think gets enough attention here. China has done, almost wonders, you could say, for that poverty group. Not to say that in a nation that big, so 500 million have joined the 300 million to have a better life, that still leaves 500 billion behind.
But they do depend on the rest of the world for their economy, the Chinese.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What they're saying is, as the seven, whatever they're called, the dragon economies said some time ago, the only way for us to grow is to export and be participants in a world economy. The old China that was totally closed was certainly not working. It was only when they opened up and said, we want to export, and their growth is an export growth. But they've added to that export growth, I think, some astute infrastructure investments. And it's hard for me to say the Chinese are astute or that they've done great things for the poor, because it is a totalitarian state. But it's a benevolent totalitarian state for most of its citizens. Hate to be a Uyghur in China, but
For most,
that's why I say, I hate to be a Uyghur. I'd hate to be living in Hong Kong and want to have it like it used to be. Or Taiwan, just offshore. Charles?
You talk about the Uyghurs. Yes, we were over there a few years ago, and it was maybe more like 20 years ago. But it was a very enjoyable experience there to see those people. And it's a little difficult now to see what's happening to them in terms of the oppression.
The Uyghurs.
Yes, that they're getting now, being imprisoned, killed, whatever one does to do that. So I think China has made strides. I'm not sure about the middle class more moving up to that. I'll accept your premise on that.
Again, I suggest...
But everything about China so far, to me, is a watch out. Look out for what China is going to be doing. They're powerful. I don't see them wanting to sit down with us and negotiate. I don't see that happening. It's been tried and it hasn't worked. Well, I agree with Frank that sometimes what happens is in the country, the people who are the most put upon, the poorest, whatever you want to call it, eventually everything reaches a level that is unsustainable. And that's where you get the what happened in Russia, happened in other countries, where they've had enough. Now, if I have to choose between having dealing with world poverty or what's good for America, I choose America.
My only response to that is I think you can do both. I think that doing our utmost to lift the poverty-stricken around the world is good for America. If we're concerned about unrest of countries revolting against the upper class, I think that's a legitimate concern. By leaving that lower class, the underclass in those countries alone, and saying, we're just going to focus on America, we're not going to do anything to help anyone abroad, is just leaving a festering sore to get worse and worse. You understand what I'm trying to say there? So I think we don't have to choose between helping the poor elsewhere and focusing on America. What's good for the world really is good for us. Among other things, everybody who has more money is part of a market. And that market is something we can satisfy as much as anybody else if we get things sorted out right. I think that just like Iran is something for us to table and spend some real time on as we go forward, I think China certainly deserves it too. And to that end, let me do some thinking about it. Would you all like a couple of sessions devoted strictly to China? Maybe get a couple of people in here who teach on it in the area?
Yes.
Let's do that. Let's do that. And maybe have a small panel where I've thought about that a lot on some of these issues. Bring in 2 or 3 people, if we can find people on different sides of the issue.
That would be the key, finding people. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the material you sent out. It's good, it's interesting material.
But it's biased.
But it's biased. I haven't seen one piece of article come out that looks at the other side. So I hope we would be a little bit more successful bringing people in.
And I will also, I take that seriously, I'll endeavor to copy things from the other side.
New York Post.
The New York Post. Carol Lee? That's not going to work, Sal.
I'm just sitting here listening to everybody talk about the rest of the world and thinking about the United States. I think we have to deal with our own terrorist groups, and I think we have to wonder who's financing the terrorist groups here that just attack the Capitol and that people keep warning are going to be attacking other capitals of the different states. I think maybe there's something we can do about that. I don't think there's anything we can do about China and Iran, frankly. But I think people have to start writing to their senators and governors and congressmen, particularly in Florida, if you want to get anything done, and start becoming more active about things related to the United States.
Well said. And by the way, part of that challenge is to talk more about the cabinet and it's changing than to talk about Iran and China. I had said earlier that a third of today, at least, would be devoted to that. We have now 10 minutes left. We'll table China and Iran. We'll come back on that with a balanced set of speakers if I can find.
Well, we may not be able to bring them in soon because of the COVID
There is
restrictions.
the COVID.
I don't think you can.
We know some great people that could contribute to the discussion of
we've
China.
talked to a few. Frank, just a quick comment, then we're going to talk about.
Okay, have we learned anything from the Potsdam Agreement and the Yalta Agreement? We sold Eastern Europe under the bus, and they rose they overcame that. And who would have believed that the Berlin Wall would fall and the Soviet bloc would be almost completely annihilated? We should be learning from the past, but I don't see it happening.
Not many read history these days, Frank.
Destined to repeat itself. Carol and Carol Lee and Phoebe, do you want to just each take 5 minutes? And I'm very sorry that I've used up all your time on the international things. What we're going to talk about, as they come up here, recent activity on the
Go get her, Phoebe.
Come on up with me.
Go get her.
on the appointments and their process through Congress.
I'm only going to do 2 because
Okay, do 2.
I want to talk about Tim Vilsack and where we have Granholm because and maybe a little bit about climate, but now I can't find my notes on it.
Pull the mic down to your mouth a little bit, Phoebe.
Well, we've got,
Your time's up.
well, let's see. Jennifer Granholm and Tim Vilsack together make a really good story because Vilsack was the governor of Iowa, and he worked in big agriculture, but he also fostered organic farming, farmers markets, and he really wants to see rural communities rebuilt. Now, big agriculture uses a lot of chemicals, and it causes terrible toxicity in water and the earth itself, so it can't grow until you put another chemical in. And so he's supporting, along with Granholm, who's an energy, Secretary of Energy, to use recycling, planting things that will give more fertile soil so that you don't continue to make the earth toxic and you still have clean water. And with climate change, we're looking at more and drier summers, so water is an issue. But if you plant trees and grass and leave the ground and not plant food for a while, then you can filter out some of the carbon in the air, and you can make the ground fertile, and it will grow better, in a couple of years. So then we have Granholm, who's an expert on climate and emissions, and worked very hard to produce electric cars and zero-emission vehicles, and also cut back on coal-fired plants, which pollute the air. And so together, we've got those two working very well hand in hand. So those two people in the cabinet are going to have a big boost to the Middle West, for sure, and making farming more sustainable. And we'll get better food and cleaner air. Yeah.
What's their status in the nominating process?
I think they still haven't been confirmed, as far as I can see.
Does anybody know?
Not yet. But they're probably going to get.
I think they're about through the committees, not yet on the floor.
Okay, Curly, do you want to say something about some of yours? Because we don't have more than 5 minutes each.
Yeah. Just seeing my papers here. I need my little stand. Sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I just want to go over the people that have already been confirmed. Phoebe and I kind of divided people up, but I'll just go over the ones who were confirmed. And Anthony Blinken, as you know, was confirmed and is starting to work as Secretary of State. As we expected, Janet Yellen was confirmed as the first woman to be the Secretary of the Treasury. And Lloyd Austin, after some controversy, was confirmed as the first black man and retired general to be the Secretary of Defense. Deb Haaland is also up. She will be the first Native American when confirmed, which is expected that she probably will be confirmed with great ease. And she will be the first Native American to ever serve as a cabinet official, which is something really amazing to think about. All of these firsts. Gina Raimondo, who was the governor of Rhode Island, is also expected to be confirmed. She will be the Secretary of Commerce. And she has a really excellent background in finance and as a public official as well. So we look forward to that. I don't know if we mentioned Marty Walsh is going to be he was the former mayor of Boston, and he's going to be nominated as the Secretary of Labor. Things are not moving around too fast in terms of the nominations and the confirmations so far. Pete Buttigieg, as we all know, will be nominated as the Secretary of Transportation, and he will be the first openly gay person ever in the United States cabinet. So we've got a lot of firsts going on. Miguel Cardona is going to be nominated as the Secretary of Education, and he will be the first Latino in the cabinet. Even though there's still a preponderance of white male men in the cabinet, there is some diversity coming in as well. And I just heard, this actually was Phoebe's person, but there's some controversy about Alejandro Mayorkas, who is up for Secretary of Homeland Security. And there's I think the governor, the senator from Colorado is up objecting to him. But he has already been confirmed 3 different times for other jobs as deputy secretaries in other positions. I think there are a lot of minor positions, but we don't want to go into those right quite yet.
Out of time.
Altogether.
Yeah,
I just wanted to mention, you were all talking about the filibuster, and I've been reading a lot about this reconciliation, and there is a way that the Senate can pass certain laws, and they can do it once a year for something related to either spending, revenue, or federal departments, and they can do it once a year, and apparently they never did any of this last year, and when they bring it up with reconciliation, they can pass things with a simple majority of 51 votes. And I think that's going to be coming into a lot of attention in the next couple of weeks, because I saw the Senator Schumer, and he indicated that this is what he's going to be trying to do with a couple of bills, particularly the COVID bill, which I think we all need, and perhaps the Republican senators won't want to vote for it. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because there's been a lot of interest in it on TV.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We're out of time, but I'd like to make a request, and this is apropos of Charles mentioning that the materials I send out have a decided bias, and it's because the things I read are more on the liberal side of the line. I am reading National Review, Red State Nation, Epoch Times, but I'm finding it hard to find articles there that hang together or on subjects. I would appreciate some inputs. If you guys, those who are who lean a little bit to the right, which is, I hope there are several of you, can find things that you'd like to see distributed, send me the link or send me the article. And it can be from the Post or the U.S. Communist Party newspaper, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you all very much. And the other thought I had as I was sitting here is COVID will prevent our having a live panel. Nothing will prevent our having a Zoom panel. And it's possible we could get a couple of people to talk, for example, about China from their home, and we'll have them video linked in. I mean, that's how people are doing it now, and they're doing it a lot. Did you want to say something? Oh, thank you all.
I was pointing at the TV.
See you next Friday.